the strong Pareto principle says that if there is at least one person who strictly prefers X to Y, while everybody else weakly prefers X to Y, then society should prefer X to Y. And if additionally you require that if everybody is indifferent as between X and Y, then so should society be indifferent between X and Y, then that will take you to this condition PP. What Sen also did was to weaken the requirement of R being a strict ordering. You only required what is called quasi-transitive quasi-transitivity, which is the condition that if X is strictly preferred to Y and Y is strictly preferred to Z, then X should be strictly preferred to Z. So in other words, you don't need transitivity to hold for the weak preference relation. You only need it to hold for the strong part of it, the strict part. So we said, what is the set of functions F which will satisfy these conditions: unrestricted domain, independence of irrelevant alternatives, and the strengthened version of the Pareto principle, and non-dictatorship? Can you guess what it would be? It's not the empty set. Actually, it exists. The only rule which will satisfy all of these conditions is what you might call the simple Pareto rule. And if there is an aggregation mechanism which satisfies all of these conditions, namely U, I, D, and PP prime, then it will say that for any pair of alternatives X and Y, X will be preferred to Y if and only if X is Pareto preferred to Y. So the only aggregation rule which satisfies these properties is the Pareto rule, which says that for any pair of alternatives X and Y, X will be declared to be strictly preferred to Y if and only if it is the case that everybody prefers X to Y. Now supposing you have a pair of alternatives which are Pareto non-comparable. That is, some people prefer X to Y and some people prefer Y to X. Then, according to this rule, notice that X is preferred to Y if and only if everybody prefers X to Y. But since everybody does not prefer X to Y, it is not the case that X is preferred to Y. Okay, in that case. But what is the definition of the strict preference rule? If X is not strictly preferred to Y, and if we are talking about a complete relationship, then Y must be at least as good as X. Right? So this will imply that Y is at least as good as X. By the same token, since X and Y are Pareto non-comparable, it is not the case that Y is preferred to X. Okay. Which must imply that X is at least as good as Y. So if X is at least as good as Y and Y is at least as good as X, if 1 is at least as tall as 2 and 2 is at least as tall as 1, that's a complicated way of saying that 1 and 2 have the same height. Okay. So what that means is that X and Y must be declared to be socially independent. So the only rule which satisfies U, I, D, and PP prime is a rule which is somewhat bizarre. It will translate every judgment on a pair of Pareto non-comparable states into a judgment on collective indifference. And this is one of the lessons which it is useful to learn, which Sen often underlines. Non-comparability is not the same thing as indifference. When I'm indifferent between X and Y, that means it doesn't really matter to me whether I choose X or Y. When X and Y are non-comparable, it doesn't mean that I'm indifferent between them. I'm simply saying that they cannot be compared. So what this preference aggregation mechanism ends up doing is to declare every pair of states on which there is an absence of unanimity to be collectively indifferent. So in other words, you don't really have a vocabulary for dealing with conflict resolution. In every case where there is a conflict of preferences, even if one person out of n prefers X to Y while the rest of them prefer Y to X, you must end up declaring that X is indifferent to Y. Or putting it differently, under the strictures which the new welfare economics held to be scientific, you can't really move beyond the Pareto principle. And the Pareto Principle is such a seriously incomplete principle that for the most part, you will end up not actually being able to rank alternatives. And the overall difficulty with this entire line of reasoning which was triggered off by the new welfare economics is again very well illustrated in a simple example of sense. You see, this whole business of making any collective judgment depend only on the set of individual utility orderings, where furthermore the utility functions are required to be ordinal and interpersonally non-comparable. This is what Sen called welfarism. And one implication of welfarism is a property called neutrality. Neutrality, as the name implies, requires that your social judgment or the ranking of any pair of alternatives must be neutral with respect to all information which is not already contained in the information which is available in the set of individual, ordinal, interpersonal, and non-comparable utility functions. You must be neutral with respect to all other such information. You can't admit any of that information to infect your judgment. The only information that you can use is individually non-comparable utility functions, ordinal utility functions. So neutrality, putting it differently, says the following. If everybody's ranking of a pair of states x and y is the same as everybody's utility ranking over some other pair of states w and z, since the only information you are allowed to use is the set of individual rankings, and since the set of individual rankings over x, y is exactly the same as the set of individual rankings over w, z, socially you must rank x and y in exactly the same way as you rank w and z. Okay, so that is the logical implication of neutrality, which itself is a logical implication of welfarism. Now, can we look at a practical application of this principle? Supposing I have a two-person distribution, okay, it's an ordered distribution where the first element will stand for the income of person 1 and the second will stand for the income of person 2. So, supposing I have distribution x, y equals to 8. All this means is person 1 has an income of 1, person 2 has an income of 9 in x, and in y, person 1 has an income of 2, person 2 has an income of 8. Similarly, define w equals 8 and z equals 9y. Now, using whatever model impulses that you have, how would you rank x and y? Which do you think is the better distribution? You prefer y to x. Yeah. Why is that? Okay, because inequality is less.
Inequality is lesser, even better.
Okay, so what does inequality actually mean here? The poorer person.
Yeah, like in X you have more extremities as compared to in Y.
That's right. Or putting it differently, the poorer person
Is less
here
poorer.
is better off than he is there, without the ranks being reversed. So this is one reason why Y might be preferred to X is because the poorer of the two individuals in Y has a higher income to X. And what you would do is to endorse a transfer of income of 1 unit from the richer person to the poorer person, which is what's happening when you're moving from X to Y. But the moment you use words like rich and poor, you're moving outside the domain of utilities. So there's really no scope for using words like rich and poor. These are not admissible words in the language of ordinal, interpersonally non-comparable utilities. So you can't really use that as an argument if you were a strict welfare economist to prefer y over x. Of course, you might say that since person 1 is worse off than person 2 in both states x and y, you would prefer to choose that alternative in which he is a little better off. Okay. But when you say one person is worse off than another person, you are guilty of making interpersonal comparisons of utilities. You can't use that line of argumentation either. What is worst of all is that if you prefer for some reason y to x, please observe this closely. What is the set of individual utility rankings between x and y? Person 1 prefers x to y, exactly in the way in which person 1 will prefer z to w, because he gets more income in z than in w. Person 2 prefers y to x. I'm sorry. Person 1 prefers y to x, and person 2 prefers x to y. In exactly the way in which person 1 prefers z to w, and person 2 prefers w to z. So you have the identical set of utility rankings over x, y as you have over w, z. And if you are going to decide that y is better than x, then you have no option, given the fact that you've been constricted by neutrality and have accepted a welfarist position, you have no option but to say that z is preferred. But then you turn around and say, no, but I don't prefer z to w, I actually prefer w to z. Okay? Because w is, as somebody said, a more equal distribution than z. But if you are committed to w prefer to z, then you're also committed to saying that x should be preferred. So you see, what we end up seeing is that most of the tenets of standard welfare economics are of little or no use at all in our coming to terms with certain fundamental issues which have to do with conflict resolution, with distribution, with notions of equality. Okay. So, what was the problem? The problem, we said, was that you're tying yourself up into knots with exclusive reliance on the set of utility orderings which are ordinal and interpersonally non-complex. So let's relax that assumption. Let's say we are going to now allow utility to be cardinal. In other words, you can actually compare gains and losses. You're also going to allow for interpersonal comparability. So you are allowed to say things like, person 1 has twice as much utility from x vis-a-vis y as person 2 does. So you can make comparisons between individuals, and you can make cardinal comparisons intra-individual, as also inter-individual. Now, you need assumptions of this nature in order to justify the ethic which is called utilitarianism. What does utilitarianism say? Utilitarianism says that given any social state x, the total welfare from x is simply the sum of individual utilities from x. Okay? Now, when you're adding up utilities, you can't simply add up utilities if they are ordinal and interpersonally non-comparable. Okay? So the only way in which you can add up utilities is if you make the assumption that they are cardinal and interpersonally comparable. So utilitarianism unashamedly makes these assumptions. And that seems to be a good thing to do, because we've seen the kind of trouble we land in when we assume the purest stance of standard welfare economics. So let's see what utilitarianism tells us about inequality. The usual convention under utilitarianism is to suggest that each utility function is cardinal, it's interpersonally comparable, it's also increasing. Okay, so if you assume the utility, so if u of x, ui of x is a typical utility function of person I, then assuming that this function is indefinitely differentiable, If it is increasing, then that means that the first derivative is positive. It just means that when income increases, my utility also increases. Okay. But you assume that utility increases at a diminishing rate to allow for what is called diminishing marginal utility. Okay. So the second derivative is negative. So that's the usual assumption which is made. So the assumption which is generally made is that individual utility functions are identical across individuals. Each utility function is increasing in its argument, say income. Okay, so the first derivative is positive, but it's increasing at a declining rate to allow for diminishing marginal utility of income. And that requires, so the second derivative is negative. Okay, so let's work with this framework. And let's consider a very simple problem of two-person distribution. Okay. Supposing we have two individuals, x and y, and let's specialize the utility function. Let's say that both these utility functions are the same. It's just the square root of x. Why do I take this particular function? As x increases, the square root of x will also increase, so it's an increasing function. What is the first derivative of this? It's 1/2 of x to the power minus 9, right? That's the first derivative, which is positive. The second derivative